want to thank really everybody who's contributed to bringing me here to Hyderabad. I've lived in other parts of India for a number of years, and somehow I made a terrible mistake all those years in that I never visited Hyderabad until now. And I'm happy I'm finally making some small rectification of that mistake, and I hope I'll have other chances in the future. So today, what I'd like to talk with you about briefly are some distributional issues in the arena of climate policy. And as most of you will know, the main distributional issues that have received most of the attention have to do with international negotiations and with the allocation of what sometimes is called the carbon space amongst the nations of the world. So at the UN negotiations, like the one that concluded in December in Lima, Peru, this is the main issue that's been discussed, as distributional questions amongst nations of the world. But what I want to do today is talk about something quite different. I want to talk with you about distributional issues within nations, within countries, and in particular within my own country, the United States. And the reason for that, I think it's important to share my motivation for doing this, is that I think that out of the international negotiations, sooner or later, some agreement will emerge, and that agreement should, and I think hopefully will, involve a commitment from the United States to make really substantial reductions in its own emissions of greenhouse gases in general and of carbon dioxide from the combustion of fossil fuels in particular. How soon that will happen, however, I don't know. And in the meantime, it's important for nations to be thinking about what policies they can and should implement, perhaps even in advance of an international agreement. And one of my efforts in the U.S. has been to think about how policies can be designed that could actually win the support of American, not only American politicians, but equally importantly, the American people, support that would be durable for the 3 or 4 decades that will be needed to ensure a clean energy transition. Having a climate policy, an effective climate policy, is not simply a matter of passing a bill and then the problem's been solved. Whatever bill is passed has to remain in force, has to remain durable throughout the vicissitudes of political life. In my country, it has to be legislation that's so widely supported, has such strong support, that it doesn't matter which party's in power, which party has the Congress, which party has the presidency, the bill will remain. And so crafting a bill that has that level of public support, that level of political durability, is one of the great challenges. And that's what sort of has led me into thinking about some of these distributional issues in climate change. At the international negotiations in Lima at the 20th meeting of the Conference of Parties, the body set up by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to discuss these issues, both mitigation and adaptation were discussed, and I'll be using these terms, so it's worth briefly, for those of you who aren't immersed in the world of climate speak, explaining what these mean. Mitigation means steps to actually reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and reduce the extent of future climate change. And at Lima, the agreement was that each country this spring will announce what it intends to do. These are called intended nationally determined contributions in order to contribute to a solution. There hasn't been any agreement on how those contributions should be partitioned amongst the countries of the world, but the idea is that individual countries should try to come up with some indicators of what they're prepared to do in advance of the next big meeting, which will be in Paris in December. Also, a fair amount of time was spent in Lima discussing adaptation. And adaptation, as opposed to mitigation, means measures to adapt to the climate change that we don't prevent, that it's too late to prevent, or that we will in the future move too slowly to prevent. And in particular, under the UN framework, a green climate fund has been established where the countries of the global north have contributed money that will be ultimately spent on adaptation around the world, perhaps primarily in the countries of the so-called global south. And both of these issues, mitigation and adaptation, have nested within them profound distributional questions which so far I would say have not received adequate attention. And I want to talk with you about three of those issues here today. The first two involve mitigation policy. One is the set of air quality co-benefits that climate policy can bring. So when we move away from combustion of fossil fuels towards a clean energy economy, when we increase energy efficiency and shift to clean and renewable sources of energy, we'll not only reduce emissions of CO2, the most important greenhouse gas, but also of a host of other pollutants which are damaging to human health. Unlike CO2, which is a global public bad, these other pollutants are localized, as I'll talk about more in a moment, raising, therefore, a number of interesting and important distributional issues. The second issue in mitigation policy that I want to discuss with you today is what I'll call carbon rent. And briefly previewing what I mean by that is that if we have, as part of the policy mix, as I'll argue we must have, a policy that results in putting a price on carbon, that raises the prices of fossil fuels so as to send signals throughout the economy to promote energy efficiency and alternative energy sources, an important question is what happens to the money that people pay as a result of pricing carbon emissions? Money that, as I'll discuss, ultimately comes out of the pocket of every consumer of fossil fuels. Where does that money go? It doesn't disappear from the world economy. It's not even a resource cost that's spent doing something. It's money that's paid to do something we already do, which is consume fossil fuels. That's the money I'll call carbon rent, and its allocation again raises profound distributional issues. And lastly, the last few minutes, I want to say a few words about distributional issues in adaptation policies. Not so much about the question of where the money for adaptation will come from, which has been the main source of debate in the international negotiations so far, but rather the question of how the limited money for adaptation, which will clearly be inadequate to the task at hand, how that limited money will be spent. What should be the priorities, which again raises a number of, I think, quite critical distributional issues. So first, air quality co-benefits. As I mentioned, when we burn fossil fuels, we also release a number of co-pollutants. Probably the most important from a public health standpoint is particulate matter. There's also sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and a host of air toxics, benzene being an example. Benzene has just been in the news recently in Delhi, where I'm living this spring. And these reductions in co-pollutants generate what in climate policy discourse are sometimes called co-benefits, in this case air quality co-benefits. The idea is the policies being undertaken with the primary objective in mind of mitigating climate change, but by undertaking that policy we're generating other benefits that are also important. And these air quality co-benefits matter for several reasons. One is that the amounts involved, the quantity of these benefits is very large. In fact, in the somewhat problematic exercises that have been undertaken to pin monetary values on the damages from carbon dioxide emissions and on the damages from co-pollutant emissions, the numbers that are assigned to damages from co-pollutant emissions are very often higher in dollar value or monetary value than the damages that are assigned to CO2 emissions. Now, putting monetary values on things like human health, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, all these things that are at stake is a really fraught exercise. In my mind, often a deeply problematic one. But my point here is not to say that these numbers are necessarily right, but these are the numbers that are informing or should be informing public policy. These are the numbers that are out there in the scientific literature, in the policy literature, and typically the air quality co-benefit numbers are similar in magnitude and often somewhat higher than the CO2 benefits. So these are not marginal, significant kind of effects. These are important effects. And the magnitude of these co-benefits, unlike the magnitude of carbon benefits, varies across and within countries. So whereas carbon pollution is a global public bad, the CO2 goes up there, it affects the world's climate. One molecule of CO2 is the same as any other molecule of CO2, regardless of where it's emitted. In the case of co-pollutants, in the case of particulate matter, for example, it matters a great deal where it's polluted, where it's emitted. It matters both because the ratio of particulate matter to CO2 emissions varies across pollution sources, and also because the public health damages resulting from those emissions vary across locations. To give you an example of the former, about how the ratio of particulates to CO2 varies, here's some data that were put together recently by this outfit called Clean Air Asia, which is funded by the Asian Development Bank and works, as the name suggests, on clean air, both on climate policy and air quality. And what they have for the major Asian countries, including both India and China, for vehicular, this is for road transportation, vehicular transportation, are estimates of total emissions of carbon dioxide and total emissions of particulate matter, which, as I mentioned, is the most serious co-pollutant in terms of public health impacts. And the interesting thing to note when you look at these numbers is that if you look at the ratio of particulate matter to carbon dioxide emissions, you find India's ratio is almost 3 times higher than that in China. That is to say, per ton of CO2, the amount of particulate matter being emitted in India is about 3 times higher. Now, I don't want to guarantee that these numbers are accurate. They're the numbers that have come up from Clean Air Asia, which has done its best, I'm sure, to come up with accurate data. But I think whatever the real numbers are, the basic point that this is a variable, it's not a constant. The ratio of co-pollutants to CO2 is a variable between countries, and as I'll show you, as I'll discuss in a moment, within countries, is an important thing to bear in mind when we think about the design of climate policy. What I'll focus in on a little bit now is how co-pollutants also vary within countries. And for this purpose, I'll refer to some work that my colleague at the University of Southern California, Manuel Pastor, and I have done on this issue in the United States, where we looked at how co-benefits, that is to say the benefits from climate policy by virtue of reduced co-pollutant emissions and better air quality, vary from place to place, or will vary from place to place within the country, from sector to sector across industrial sectors, and from facility to facility amongst facilities within any given industrial sector. And if you're interested, if you have any trouble finding the papers that I refer to here, I'd be happy to send copies. Here's an example that sort of we use to motivate our study. These are 2 major sources of carbon dioxide emissions in the state of California. Both emit about 3 million tons of CO2 per annum. The ExxonMobil facility is a refinery, a petroleum refinery, located in a place called Torrance, California, which is part of metropolitan Los Angeles. And La Paloma is a coal-burning power plant located outside of a town called Bakersfield, California. The Bakersfield facility, the power plant, although both these plants emit the same amount of CO2 roughly, the Bakersfield plant, the La Paloma facility, emits about 50 tons per annum of particulate matter, and living within a 6-mile radius of that plant, there are a total of about 600 people. It's a very sparsely settled area. It's out in the desert. If we compare that to the oil refinery in Torrance, the PM emissions are 7 times as high, about 350 tons per annum, and the population, within a 6-mile radius is 800,000. So if you think about those differences both in the quantity of particulate matter emitted and in the number of people impacted by those emissions, it actually does make a difference where you reduce your emissions. It's not the case that a molecule of CO2 is a molecule of CO2 regardless of where it's emitted, because along with those molecules of CO2, there also are particulate matter, NOx, SOx, all these other pollutants. And in particular, if one were to have what's called a cap and trade policy, a market-based permits-based policy where you have permits to emit carbon dioxide, and those permits can be traded amongst firms. A typical cap-and-trade policy, and the state of California has instituted such a policy now under its own Global Warming Solutions Act, would allow, and in California does allow, say the oil refinery in Torrance to buy permits from the power plant in La Paloma on the assumption that it doesn't matter where you release the CO2, it all brings the same benefit, and therefore the places that can reduce emissions most cheaply should do so more, and the places that want to buy permits should be able to buy permits. But in a case like this, actually, it doesn't make sense, I would submit, that one would substitute emissions reductions here for emissions reductions in Torrance, where the public health benefits are potentially so much greater. So in our study, we go through not only these variations in the number of people impacted and the extent of pollution associated with fossil fuel combustion at industrial facilities in the United States, but we also look at issues sometimes called in U.S. parlance environmental justice. That is to say, the distribution of impacts of these air pollutants across communities, particularly looking at differences between high-income and low-income communities and between communities that are predominantly white versus communities that have large percentages of African Americans and or Latinos, because that racial and ethnic dimension of the distribution of pollution has been shown to be an important and rather systematic variable in the United States. Systematic in the sense that African American and Latino communities typically bear much higher pollution burdens, and in U.S. policy there are now environmental justice provisions that require, for example, all federal agencies to reduce these disparities between communities correlated with class, race, and ethnicity. And this map from an earlier piece of work that Manuel and I and a few other colleagues did looks at the difference between exposure of racial and ethnic minorities and their share of the population. What we find in Colorado, Kentucky, and Tennessee, the darkest states here, for example, is that the percentage of health impacts due to pollution from industrial facilities is at least 15% greater as a percentage of the population than their share in the population. In other words, you might have 30% of the health impacts being borne by African Americans, even though they constitute, let's say, 12 or 13% of the population in the state. It's a measure of these disparities. And so from an environmental justice standpoint, as well as an efficiency standpoint, paying attention to co-pollutants and designing climate policy to take the co-benefits into account seems to us to make sense. Since I've been in Delhi, I've started to pay a little bit of attention to Delhi's air pollution problem. It kind of hits you in the face and in the lungs in particular. So I can't pretend to have any expertise on this, but I have been reading through the literature, and I've come through across a few articles which suggest that there may be similar issues within India, within the Indian population as well. So this is a study by Professor Garg, who teaches at IIM Ahmedabad, in which he overlaid maps of particulate matter pollution in Delhi with maps of socioeconomic status. And what he found was that low-income communities typically had worse pollution burdens, and he also draws attention to the fact that a lot of that pollution is coming from private motor vehicles that are owned by the richest stratum of the population. So the benefits from the activities that are generating the problem accrue primarily to those who are better off, and the costs in terms of public health, those burdens accrue primarily to the poorest and least powerful segment of the population. So I think there are distributional issues in most countries in the world, not only in my own. One of the reasons why there may be those differences was illuminated in another study by Foster and Kumar. Foster, some of you will have encountered his work on poverty. He's a famous economist at Brown. Kumar is an atmospheric scientist who now teaches at the University of Miami. And they did a piece where they got samples sample survey data from Delhi, and they looked at socioeconomic status, and they looked at respiratory ailments connected with air pollution exposure. And what they found was much more incidence of these ailments among low-income households. And they speculate on various reasons why that might happen: air conditioning, better nutritional status, whatever, for the rich. But one of the interesting things to me was the data they found on how much time people spend outdoors. They found a monotonic relationship, pretty much, between income and time outdoors, where the poorer you were, the more time you spent outdoors. And there was also a gender difference. In this case, men spent more time outdoors than women. And the reason this is important is the outdoor levels of air pollution are considerably higher than the indoor levels, particularly, of course, if the place you are outdoors is on or near major transportation arteries, major roads, because so much of the particulate matter is coming from vehicular emissions. So that may help to underline some of these distributional differences. The policy implications we've drawn from our work on co-pollutants in co-benefits in climate policy can be summarized briefly here, and I want to do that before moving on to carbon rent. The first is pretty simple, that if you design a carbon policy, a climate policy, without taking co-benefits into account, well, actually, that's the second one, so let me go back to the first one. The first one is simply that your targets ought to be stronger, because the benefits are not only benefits from reducing climate emissions, carbon emissions, but also benefits to public health from reducing these other pollutants. So there's immediately a case for a more stringent policy once we recognize the existence of these public health benefits. We're not only emitting CO2, we're emitting poisons when we burn fossil fuels. The second is that even if we design a climate policy without taking co-benefits into account, we minimally ought to be monitoring how that policy is impacting the distribution of emissions resulting from the burning of fossil fuels. And we ought to be looking out to see, in particular, whether the policy is mitigating or exacerbating the extent of environmental injustice. One of the reasons why many environmental justice communities are quite suspicious of market-based policies, including cap and trade, for reducing carbon emissions is that they fear that although overall emissions targets may be met, their communities will be hotspots where emissions are concentrated. And it's even possible that emissions could go up in their communities even as overall emissions reductions objectives are achieved. For example, in the case of carbon policy, one of the things that sometimes is discussed, and in fact it's happening in the United States, is shutting down old coal-fired power plants and bringing online new natural gas-fired electrical generation facilities. And those gas-fired facilities are typically located much closer to population centers than the coal-burning power plants. So in the communities around those gas-fired plants, which tend to be low-income minority communities, you may see emissions go up. So minimally, we ought to be looking for those problems and taking steps to rectify them if and when we see them emerging. We think, however, one can go further than that. And one of the ways one can do so is designate locations, spatial zones, where it's particularly important to achieve reductions in co-pollutants, air quality benefits, because these are zones that historically have borne disproportionate burdens. And so it's quite possible to design climate policies that are spatially differentiated to try to ensure that you get more emissions reductions where you get greater public health benefits. And in fact, this is already done in California in the case of their cap and trade program for nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide. They divided, when they created the cap and trade program in the 1990s, they had a high priority zone, zone 1, and a low priority zone, zone 2, and facilities in zone 1 couldn't buy permits from zone 2. And the result of that is that the permit price in zone 1 is actually 8 times higher now than in zone 2 because of this limitation they've made on the exchange of permits. It's a way of recognizing that the extent of benefits may in fact vary from place to place, rather than saying a one size or one price fits all policy is appropriate. Similarly, just as we can designate certain zones for targeting greater emissions reductions, we could potentially designate certain industrial sectors or certain facilities. So for example, we found that the petroleum refinery sector in the United States typically generates higher co-pollutant damages. There's more, as we saw in that example from Torrance, there tends to be more pollution per ton of CO2, and also they tend to be located in more densely populated areas. So there's a case for prioritizing emissions reductions from the petroleum refinery sector as opposed to other sectors for the same reasons, to maximize or at least increase those public health benefits. And finally, and this is a segue into what I want to say about carbon rent, we argue that if there is a price-based mechanism that's part of the policy that's putting a price on carbon, some of the carbon rent that is obtained in that fashion should be allocated to what we call community benefit funds in those communities that are most heavily overburdened by environmental problems in general and air pollution problems in particular. This money could be used for public health, for environmental improvements, etc. It's a way of trying to redress some of the inequities in the current distribution of pollution damages. That sort of brings me on to the topic of carbon rent. In the climate justice movement, in which I have many friends who've worked over the years, one of the slogans that's often voiced is keep the oil in the soil, keep the coal in the hole, just say no to fossil fuel extraction. That's sort of the policy. There's actually a deep suspicion about the kinds of policies I'm just about to suggest to you that involve using pricing as a policy instrument. And their goal is we should just say no. The people of the Niger Delta, for example, in Nigeria, should rise up and say, we're going to stop this oil extraction because it's damaging our environment, we're not getting the benefits anyway, and it's contributing to global warming. And if major places like the Niger Delta were somehow to achieve that, were to keep the oil in the soil, that would have some effects, some economic effects as well as climate effects. And the simple economics of it is that it would restrict the supply. Most of you I think have studied economics. So it would restrict the supply. The price would go up as the quantity of fossil fuels in the market would go down. And the price would go up a lot more than the quantity goes down because demand for fossil fuels is price inelastic, right? So that a small percentage reduction in quantity is associated with a large percentage reduction in price. And that increase in price times the new quantity is what I'm going to be calling carbon rent. That's the money generated if we restrict supply by keeping the oil in the soil, or by implementing a carbon tax, or by putting a cap on the total amount of carbon we're going to burn in our economy, or for that matter, in the world. The price goes up as a result of that supply restriction. Now, who pays that carbon rent? Where does the money come from the price going up? It ultimately comes from consumers. It comes from everybody who consumes fossil fuels in proportion to their use of fossil fuels, both direct and indirect. By direct, I mean when you go buy petrol to fill up your automobile, that's direct use. Indirect use is when you go buy, say, a manufactured good. Some fossil fuels were used in manufacturing and distributing that good, and that too, that price increase in fossil fuels gets passed along into the cost of other commodities. So when we trace through where the money comes from that is generated by a pricing policy, in absolute terms, the rich pay more money than the poor because the rich consume more than the poor. They have bigger carbon footprints. They fly in airplanes, they drive big cars, they have big houses to heat or cool, etc., etc. But in relative terms, in many countries, including the United States, the poor actually pay more than the rich. And that's because fuels are a necessity, not a luxury, and so their share in the limited consumption budget of the poor is often higher than it is in that of the rich. So in that sense, raising the price of carbon is like having a regressive tax. It's a tax that takes a bigger bite as a share of income from the poor than it does from the rich. So that's on the who pays side of the picture. It's coming from consumers in proportion to their carbon footprints in the ways I've described. That regressive characteristic is clear from data that we've looked at in the United States. This is from a study I did with a former grad student of mine where we used consumer expenditure survey data and input-output table data to trace through the carbon footprints, both direct and indirect, of households. And what we found is that although high-income households have bigger carbon footprints than low-income households, it's not a strictly linear relationship. It's concave, as you can see. As a percentage of their income, the poor use more than the rich. That's not necessarily the case everywhere. And so in another study I did with some colleagues, we looked at the same question in the case of China, applying the same technique using expenditure survey data and input-output tables. And we found that in China, actually, the rich not only consume more in absolute terms than the poor of fossil fuels, but even as a percentage of their income, they consume more. When you think about the low income end of the range, in China, people are consuming very little in fossil fuels. And this didn't surprise me. When I lived in Bangladesh in a village in the 70s, people's fossil fuel consumption was approximately zero. I mean, the only fossil fuel I remember anybody ever using was they bought a little bit of kerosene and they put it in these ink bottles with a wick, and they used that for illumination at night before they went to sleep. And, you know, a liter of kerosene would probably last for more than a year. That was it in terms of their fossil fuel consumption. Whereas the rich, driving cars, flying in airplanes, etc., you can imagine how their carbon footprints would be considerably greater. So in a country like China, actually a carbon tax or a carbon price would not in and of itself be regressive. It would be progressive, and it would be interesting to know how it looks if one were to do this kind of exercise in India. If you know of any such exercises, please let me know. I've been looking for them. And if not, I think it'd be quite an interesting bit of research to see how does carbon footprint vary across the income spectrum in this country. And one can disaggregate between rural and urban, look into a number of interesting issues as we did in the case of China. But the real question I want to focus in on now is not who pays for the carbon emissions. We know that's coming from consumers. We know the rich are paying more than the poor, at least absolutely, if not relatively. But rather the question, who gets the money? Where does the money go? Because when we have a policy-induced change in the price of fossil fuels, either because we keep the oil in the soil, which is what OPEC does when it wants to raise oil prices, or because environmental reasons we keep the oil in the soil, or we put a price on carbon through taxes, or we put a cap on carbon, that's going to generate this higher prices that consumer pays. And the question is, who gets the money? Well, in the case of just keeping the oil in the soil, if that's all we do, as my buddies in the climate justice movement often advocate, where does the money go? Where does the carbon rent in that case go? Well, it goes to people like this. These guys you may not recognize. They're called the Koch Brothers, K-O-C-H. They've become very famous in the United States in the last few years because they're the major funders of this kind of populist right-wing party called the Tea Party, and more important for our purposes, they're the major funders of what are sometimes called climate deniers. That is to say, research and advocacy groups that deny that there's any connection between burning fossil fuels and climate change. There's no such thing as anthropogenic climate change. The climate just changes anyway. There have been ice ages, now it gets warmer. People's activities don't have anything to do with it, right? They are among the richest men in the United States and in the top 5 multi-billionaires with major investments in the fossil fuel industry. Similarly, the countries that don't keep the oil in the soil, they will get the carbon rent. In other words, those who keep the oil in the soil don't get any money, but the others who are still not keeping the oil in the soil, the renegades, they will get the money, right? And this redistribution of money from the consumers of the world to the remaining oil producers of the world has not only economic effects in terms of widening economic inequalities, but also, of course, has political effects. So the Koch brothers these days are major funders of political campaigns. The lifting of restrictions on campaign contributions has opened the door to their efforts to effectively buy elections, convert the democratic election process into a market where instead of one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. And these guys have lots of dollars $1. It has political effects. I mean, the reality is we're between the two of one person, one vote, and $1, one vote. Similarly, you know, if you think about money flowing to the oil-rich kingdoms in the Middle East, you know, that's an American fighter plane bought by of the type bought by the Saudi Air Force. You have political effects from this redistribution of money, and it's not necessarily the kinds of effects that a person who's an advocate of climate justice or global justice would necessarily welcome. So how can we do something different with the carbon rent rather than redistribute it to those who aren't keeping the oil in the soil? Well, a way we can achieve exactly the same effect in terms of reducing carbon emissions worldwide is either to put a cap on our consumption of fossil fuels or to impose a tax on the price of fossil fuels. These are basically equivalent. If you cap emissions and let the price rise, or you charge a tax raising the price and let the quantity decrease, the price goes up, the quantity goes down. Again, the quantity doesn't go down as much as the price goes up. That means the higher the price, the more revenue, the bigger the amount of carbon rent. Even though the quantity goes down, the price goes up faster. And so you get this carbon rent. You get that as an effect of the policy. And in the public debates about climate policy in the United States, it's remarkable how little attention this is received. Really, people hardly realize that it's an issue. They hardly talk about it. And yet, it's a multi-trillion-dollar issue, as I will suggest to you in a moment. First, why would we want to have pricing policies as part of the policy mix? Why not just have regulations, low carbon fuel standards for automobiles, renewable portfolio standards for power plants, etc.? Well, we've got all of those too in states like California, but putting a price on carbon is widely considered, and I agree with this, to be a critical, necessary part of the policy mix. Not the only policy, but one of the policies, for two reasons. One is the short-run timing. If we want to reduce carbon emissions, you can do things to try to limit demand for carbon. You can build mass transit systems, for example, but those are going to take time. And if we feel like we don't have time and we want to achieve emissions reductions quickly, pricing carbon is a way to get those immediate reductions. And secondly, those price increases are what help to induce the changes on the demand side in terms of energy efficiency, substitution to clean fuels, mass transit systems, etc., right? Regulations can do some of that demand shifting, but the way I sometimes put it is regulations are like constructing a dam against the flow of the river. You know, they can hold back the water, but the water always wants to flow downhill. In this case, energy use always wants to flow downhill to the cheapest source of energy. So unless you change the price, you're going to have that tendency to run around the regulations and still end up with excessive emissions. And finally, a reason to price carbon, as I'm going to argue, is that you can actually use that carbon rent in ways that build long-term durable public support for the policy. So what are we talking about here in terms of pricing carbon? As I've mentioned, there are two ways you can do it. You can either put on a tax, charge so much for every ton of fossil fuels, of carbon in fossil fuels that enters the economy, at every tanker terminal, at every coal mine head, at every natural gas pipeline terminal. You measure the amount of coal, oil, natural gas coming in, you calculate the amount of carbon in that, and you charge a tax to the company that's bringing it in. That's one way to do it. Equivalently, you have a cap. You say these are the number of permits we're going to allow to bring tons of carbon in, and each time a ton is brought into the economy at that tanker terminal or whatever, the firm has to surrender a permit. 1 ton, 1 permit. A permit doesn't mean you can bring in a ton a year forever. It means you can bring in a ton. You want to bring in another ton, you have to pay another permit. You have to surrender another permit. So the difference is simple. A tax sets the price and lets the quantity vary. A cap sets the quantity and lets the price vary. And because we can't know for sure what the relationship between quantity and price is going to be at any given time, it seems to me that given that our policy target is really to get the quantity right, a cap makes more sense than a tax if we do the cap in the right way, and I'll describe what the right way, part of what the right way means now briefly. However we do this, we're talking about big price increases. Estimates of the short-run price elasticity of demand for fossil fuels usually are in the range of minus 0.3. That is to say, a 7% reduction in quantity would be associated with about a 23% increase in the price. And a 7% reduction in quantity is just the beginning. What the policy target has been in past efforts to introduce climate policies in the United States, and what's recommended globally as a target by scientists, is an 80% reduction in the quantity of emissions by the year 2050, right? So if you get an 80% reduction in emissions, you're talking about really, really substantial increases in the prices of fossil fuels. And in America, in my country at least, these are the single most politically sensitive price in the entire economy. On every street corner in the country, you'll see the price posted in 12-inch high numbers at the petrol pumps, at the gas stations, where they're advertising the price of gas, right? So people will notice these price increases. So the political question, it's not just an economic question, it's a political question. How can you devise a policy that's going to cause the most politically sensitive price in the United States to rise to unprecedented levels as a result of that policy, and the public is not going to demand that the bums who pass that policy get thrown out of office? They're not going to demand the repeal of that policy. Instead, they're going to say, that's great, we want to ratchet down the cap even further and drive the price up even higher, because that's what's going to be necessary in order to make the clean energy transition. How do you devise such a policy? The amount of money we're talking about, I said it's a multi-trillion-dollar question. Here's some back-of-the-envelope calculations of what it would look like to reach that 80% reduction target by 2050 in the United States. And indeed, if the U.S. were to really do the right thing, they'd reduce more than 80% because of their historic responsibility at the international plane. But let's say they just go for 80%, the overall average. So in the first 6 years of the policy, if you implemented that policy today, roughly speaking, you'd cap emissions at 6 billion tons a year of CO2. The price, I reckon, would be about $15. That would generate about $90 billion a year, or more than $500 billion over the 6 years. And as we go out into the future and ratchet down the cap, ratchet down the quantity, the price rises, and the price rises faster than the quantity diminishes, so because of that inelasticity of demand, and so the revenue rises even higher. And over the period up till 2050, we end up with something on the order of $5.5 trillion of revenue. That's a lot of money, right? This will be, if and when we get a policy like this in the United States, and I think it's a question of when, not if. Sooner or later, reality wins and we'll have a policy. This will be the biggest single creation of property rights in the history of the United States. This is like literally creating property out of the air, right? This carbon rent is somebody's property. And the question is, whose property is it going to be? And unfortunately, most of the public are totally asleep on this issue and haven't even tuned in to the question. So one of the things I've been trying to do is lift it up. This pricing is a resolution of what economists would call a congestion problem. And congestion problems are quite familiar. We have them with parking, right? And how do we create parking solutions so that if you're parked in here and you go back to get your vehicle, you can actually get it out of the lot? How do we deal with that? Well, we use a combination of regulations and pricing. We have those little lines that say you're supposed to park here. We have trucks that come and pull out the cars or put tickets on the cars that don't park properly. And we charge money. We have parking meters or lots where you pay a fee to park. These are ways of resolving the congestion problem. And what we're talking about here is a similar congestion problem. It's the congestion of the global parking lot for carbon dioxide rather than the concrete parking lot for automobiles, but it's the same basic category of problem. And just as charging for parking doesn't mean we're putting up the parking lot for sale. We have parking meters on the streets, the public streets in my town in Amherst. That doesn't mean we're selling the streets or privatizing the streets. It just means we're not letting people use those for free because they're subject to a congestion problem. There's scarcity of space. Similarly, if we put on prices on carbon emissions, it doesn't mean we're putting the atmosphere up for sale, right? It doesn't mean we're commodifying nature, which is a claim that sometimes is meant. What it means is that we're not letting people use the scarce resources of nature for free. That's not making it a commodity, it's making it no longer free. It's solving what economists sometimes call the open access problem, sometimes mistakenly, in my view, called the tragedy of the commons. It's really the tragedy of open access. As we introduce climate policy, we move away from an open access regime for carbon emissions to a regime in which we've got some rights. The right to regulate access is what regulatory standards do. Putting a price on emissions, furthermore, moves along that property rights spectrum to create a price that must be paid to use the assets when it's legal to do so. In the first case, the polluter pays the cost of abatement, of meeting the regulations. In the second case, the polluter also pays the cost for the pollution that's not abated, the social cost. So in what jurisprudence literature calls the bundle of sticks that constitute property rights, in the regulatory standards case, it's the right to set access rules. That's the stick in the bundle. In the case of price-based regulation, you not only have access rules, you still have the lines in the parking lots. You may still have, emissions, fuel standards for automobiles, but you also have the right to receive income, resource rent, from the use of the scarce resource. So recapping, consumers pay in proportion to their use of the scarce resource, and the key question is, who gets the money? In other words, who are the de facto or de jure owners of that atmospheric parking lot into which we're putting carbon emissions? And quickly, there are three basic possibilities. One is, we say it's owned by the fossil fuel corporations. After all, they're already spewing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Why not give them the property rights and just say, now we're going to put a cap on how much you can spew, right? That's the policy known as cap and trade in the United States. That's the policy that has been attempted and failed in the legislature in the US several times to become national law. And what I call it is actually cap and giveaway in trade, because the policy involves giving the permits, the limited number of permits, the quantity of which is set by the cap, giving them away for free to the corporations on the basis of some historical formula, usually involving their emissions. The more you emitted in the past, the more free permits you get. In the environmental economics literature, this is sometimes described as grandfathering. I'm actually scheduled to become a grandfather tomorrow. My daughter's having a baby tomorrow in England. At least that's the expected date. So I actually think grandfathering is an ageist and sexist term, and I never use it to describe giving away free permits to polluters. I describe it as cap and giveaway. That's what it is. It's giving away that $5.5 trillion in the US property to the polluters. And the political bargain that the Democrats have had in mind in offering this to the polluters is that this will somehow dent their opposition to a climate policy. The fossil fuel firms will get windfall profits, because if you give them free permits, the prices still go up. You've restricted supply. They didn't have to pay for the permits that allow them to meet that supply, and they get the money. And those profits are distributed in proportion to ownership of stocks in the corporations. Some of the ownership is foreign, so some of it flows out of the country. That's cap and trade, cap and giveaway and trade. And actually the same thing happens if you just keep the oil in the soil. Exactly the same result. Ironically, it's just like cap and trade in that particular respect. It's in effect giving windfall profits to the people who don't keep their oil in the soil. A second option is what I call cap and spend. In this case, the permits aren't given away for free. If it's a cap, the permits are auctioned rather than being given away. This is not rocket science to do. We already do it in the northeastern states under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. For power plants, there are quarterly auctions of CO2 permits. It happens online electronically. The transaction costs are negligible compared to the value of the permits being auctioned. So you auction the permits, you set the number by the cap, you see what the auction price is, you distribute them on that basis, perhaps quarterly. You don't give them away. Or alternatively, you can do the same thing by using a tax. You have a tax and the money's collected by the government, and under cap and spend, the government keeps the money. And the government can use it for expenditure. It can use it to cut other taxes. There are all kinds of possibilities. And how you feel about this policy partly depends about how you feel about the government. In my case, that's John McCain and Joe Lieberman. McCain's still a senator, Republican. Lieberman was a Democrat turned independent senator. They were the co-sponsors of cap and trade legislation in the United States that included a cap and spend component. When we look at how they spend the money, we've always got to remember the difference between the government we wish we had and the government we've got. And personally, I don't have a lot of confidence that they would spend the money in ways that I would find terribly palatable. But that's one option. And in certain ways, at least, it's better than, to my mind, than cap and trade, where you just give away the permits for free. And then the third option, and the one that I personally favor and have written about quite a bit, is called cap and dividend. So in this case as well, the permits are auctioned, or equivalently there's a tax, and the money is not kept by the government, but it's recycled to the public on an equal per capita basis. These are called dividend payments. So every man, woman, and child in the country receives an equal share of the total revenue. What does that mean? It means that the family that has a large carbon footprint, the wealthier families typically, that fly around in airplanes and have big gas guzzling automobiles and heat huge houses, they pay more than they get back. And the families that have small carbon footprints, above all low-income families, particularly in cities where people don't even own automobiles, they get back more than they put in. So the result of cap and dividend is a redistribution of income from the top to the bottom. And because income and consumption are so skewed towards the tops in the United States, in fact, with this system, roughly 70 to 80% of households receive back more than they pay in. There's a difference between the median and the average here. The average is much higher because it's pushed up by the rich, and everybody gets back that average amount of carbon payment per household. So 70 to 80% of the households get back more than they would otherwise pay. And what that does is it protects the purchasing power of working families in the face of the price increases that are needed to address the problem of climate change. Politically, I think, frankly, I can't imagine any other politically durable way to achieve the kind of climate policy that we need in the U.S. other than making sure that the revenue goes back to the public in a very clear and transparent fashion. This is, again, not rocket science. The state of Alaska already has something called the Alaska Permanent Fund that collects royalties from oil that's extracted in Alaska and distributes it back to the people of Alaska every year in an equal per capita amount. This is from their website. It's very easy to sign up. You provide evidence that you're a resident of Alaska. You fill out a 2-page form online. You send them, copies of your driver's license or your electric bill or whatever, and you get your checks in the mail. In fact, usually not in the mail. It's electronic deposit into your bank account because that's a cheaper way to distribute money, and that's how most recurrent payments to individuals from government are now handled in the United States. You can imagine this is a very popular policy in Alaska, generating roughly $1,000 per person every year, sometimes more, sometimes less. Interestingly, the biggest payout was under Governor Sarah Palin. This was a policy instituted by a Republican governor. It's politically very popular in Alaska. It has bipartisan support. No party in Alaska is going to argue to stop doing these payments. The only real difference between that and what I'm proposing is that in the case of Alaska, these are royalties on oil extraction. So there's an incentive for Alaskans to want to extract more oil. Whereas payments from carbon rent, from capping emissions, actually generate an incentive to have a tighter and tighter cap because the price rises faster than the quantity goes down, and that generates more revenue. So having such a policy in place would not only ensure that people are willing to have prices go up, it actually, once they recognize the relationship between price and revenue, would lead to a situation where they want the cap to ratchet down even faster because it will increase their financial gains, as well, of course, as improving their air quality, going back to the co-benefits I discussed before. This idea of redistributing the money to the people on an equal per capita basis, I would suggest, but you tell me if it has any resonance in India or not, I would suggest it's actually consonant with a set of principles, values that are pretty widely shared around the world, which was expressed in the caption of this mural painted by the great Mexican artist Diego Rivera that I once saw in Mexico City, which says, "The earth belongs to all, like the air and the water and the light and heat of the sun." In other words, these are the gifts of nature. Religious folks would call it the gifts of creation, and they belong to everybody. They don't belong to the corporations. They don't belong to the government. They're not commodities that should be distributed according to purchase power. They're not privileges that should be distributed according to political power. These are basic entitlements that we all share in equal and common measure. That's the principle that underlines such a policy. Lastly, I want to, because I know I'm running a little over time here, I want to say just a couple words about adaptation. This last issue where there are, I think, really important distributional issues which have so far received insufficient attention. One is about who will pay, the other is about who will benefit, about how the money will be allocated. On the who will pay side, there's been a lot of discussion, but it's the allocation I want to focus in on. This is the skyline of Manhattan. One of the ways you can spend adaptation money is to protect that very expensive real estate by building seawalls, etc., etc. This is New Orleans in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. And these are people who were wading, as you can see, through the water. Left behind in New Orleans were the poorest people who couldn't escape the storm because they didn't have private automobiles and there was inadequate public transportation, inadequate emergency services, and hundreds of people lost their lives in Hurricane Katrina. They drowned. And they were almost entirely very poor people and predominantly African American, right? So as we think about allocating adaptation assistance, we're going to have limited resources. There's not going to be enough money to do it all. What are we going to prioritize? Are we going to prioritize protecting the property values of that real estate? We're going to protect the lives of these very poor people. Well, that's, I would submit to you, a really important policy question, and we ought to be starting to have the debate now because this kind of thing is going to happen more. You'll have a similar set of questions to face here in India. I just flew in from Mumbai on Sunday. That's a picture I took off the web that supposedly is Mumbai. I guess it is. That may be a little more familiar. That's from the cyclone that hit coastal Andhra, I think in 2013. You've got similar kinds of questions here. How is adaptation money, insofar it's available from international sources or national sources, what's going to be the priority? What are we going to protect? And the principles on which we're going to allocate this money at this point are completely unclear, completely ill-defined. For example, in the Green Climate Fund, which is the main mechanism set up by the UN to allocate allocation money from the north to the south, it has the statement that the fund will operate in a transparent and accountable manner guided by efficiency and effectiveness. Now, English is a sloppy language, and people sometimes think efficiency and effectiveness or cost effectiveness are the same thing. But they're not the same thing. They're very different things, or at least they can mean different things. Efficiency, as those of you who have studied economics will know, means that you use cost-benefit analysis to decide what the environmental target is, the environmental objective. You weigh up the costs of loss in human life, for example, against the benefits in terms of saving human lives against the cost of doing things to protect those lives, and you decide what's the efficient level of protection? How much should we be spending to save the lives of those people in New Orleans, right? That's using efficiency as a basis to define the environmental objectives. Cost effectiveness is a more modest use of economics, and I would submit to you a more appropriate one in that it says, well, once we set a target, say our target is we want to achieve a certain minimum level of safety for everyone, regardless of how rich, poor, white, black, whatever they are. What's the most cost-effective way to meet that objective? The objective is not defined by efficiency. Economics is used to figure out how best to meet that objective, how most cost-effectively. Sometimes people say efficiently to meet the objective. But there's a difference between these two, and that difference, that ambiguity is right there in the statements, the founding statements of the Green Climate Fund. I mean, really, people haven't even lifted this up to talk about it. Most people don't even understand it, you know. One way to decide how to prioritize it, what I call the wealth-based approach, is based on this principle, which was articulated so baldly, so frankly, so clearly in the statement that the economic logic of dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and I think we ought to face up to it. They have lower wages, lower productivity, lower willingness to pay, etc., etc. Therefore, it's efficient for them to have more pollution, more toxic waste than higher earners, higher income people who have higher willingness to pay and more productivity, etc. The person who said this, as some of you will know, is Larry Summers, who at the time was chief economist of the World Bank. When the memo was leaked and published in The Economist in '92, this created a furor. What's interesting to think about is that what Summers was here describing, and to be fair to the man, he now says this was meant to be, kind of a thought-provoking and provoked debate, which it certainly did. It was such a debate that he ended up leaving the World Bank, though he landed on his feet as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs under Clinton, then Treasury Secretary, then President of Harvard University. But anyway, what he was saying here is actually the principle that's embedded in that efficiency criterion in cost-benefit analysis. The principle is that you decide the efficient level of environmental protection, weighing up costs and benefits. You measure all those things in dollars, and the measurement techniques that are used typically assign lower value to clean air, clean water, protection of health and safety for people who are poor because they have less willingness to pay. Just like they have less willingness to pay for everything. It's kind of like the market being extended to public health. My own view is that that's not an appropriate way to value human lives. And in fact, an alternative way, an alternative set of principles, which I would call the rights-based approach, is embodied in the most fundamental of legal documents in many, many countries around the world. So for example, in the post-apartheid Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, it says, every person shall have the right to an environment which is not detrimental to his or her health or well-being. I understand that language was actually put in there by an Indian jurist who was consulted in writing the Constitution. Similarly, in my own state, Massachusetts, that's the guy who wrote the Massachusetts Constitution. His name's John Adams. He was the second president of the United States, too. There's similar language. The people have the right to clean air and clean water, etc. Here, the basic principle is that we have a right. It doesn't say people have the right to clean air and clean water insofar as they have willingness to pay for it, right? Insofar as it's efficient to meet that right. No, it says they have the right. And that right is irrespective of their purchasing power or their political power. So I would submit to you that in discussions and debates about adaptation policy in the years ahead, which unfortunately we are condemned to have by virtue of the fact that the world, and my country is the number one to blame for this, the world has failed to address the issue of climate change in a timely and effective manner. We're going to have a lot of debates about how adaptation money gets spent. And in those debates, there's going to be a real tension between the wealth-based approach and the rights-based approach. And there are going to be real distributional tensions between the people who would benefit from allocation investments across the income spectrum. So to recap, I've discussed three distributional issues in climate policy. One is air quality benefits. The second is carbon rent. The third is adaptation costs and benefits. And the bottom line is that climate policy is not just about people versus the planet. That's not what the whole issue's about. It's not just about current generations and our well-being versus future generations. There are ways in which we can design climate policy to benefit the current generation. So we're not sacrificing on behalf of the future. We're actually benefiting ourselves from cleaner air and from our share of the carbon rent, for example, also from the job creation of implementing such a policy. So climate policy is also about the distribution of rights, of income, of health, and of safety within the present generation. And I think those are really important issues to have as part of the debate as the world moves forward through these intended nationally determined contributions into the Paris negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there. Thank you all very much, and happy to take questions. Thank you.